Hey there, my wedding planning friends, and welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, thanks so much for clicking on my video. I'm Emily Summer. I'm a wedding planner based in Montana, and I make weekly videos on wedding planning tips and advice. So in the last couple of years, we've seen an increase in a lot more intimate, smaller micro weddings. And as I'm seeing that continue on into this wedding season, I thought it would be helpful to do a video on a few quick tips if you are thinking about planning or you are planning a micro wedding of your own. First of all, if you are not really familiar with what a micro wedding is or how to plan it or kind of what I'm even really talking about here, I did do a video a while back all about micro weddings that'll go into a lot more detail on what I'm talking about in this video. So if you want to check that out, I will link that above for you. But today we're just going to talk about 5 tips that I have for planning a micro wedding. So tip number 1, when you're in the beginning stages of planning your micro wedding, the planning process is very similar to that of a traditional standard wedding, but you want to understand which vendors really vary depending on your guest count. So which ones are really going to be affected by the number of guests that you have, and kind of choose vendors according to that. So things like your photographer, your DJ, and your venue, those prices aren't really going to change no matter how many guests you have. So you don't need to feel like you need like a budget photographer or have a certain level of budget for your photographer simply because you have a smaller number of guests, or vice versa. They're going to be providing the same service. Perhaps the day is a little bit shorter than it would be if you were having a larger guest count at your wedding, but the actual service, the cost of those vendors is going to be the same. Things that will vary, however, are your caterers, your alcohol catering as well, and your rentals. So things like tables, chairs, linens, all of that sort of thing are going to rely very heavily on your guest count. So keep that in mind as you are starting to make your decisions and thinking about which vendors to use. Number 2, I'm going to expand on this since I touched on the fact that your venue doesn't change based on your guest count. So this will likely be the first thing that you are figuring out when planning your micro wedding is your venue. So keep that in mind and don't feel restricted to using an actual traditional venue, because many venues are set up for large guest counts, right? So if you're having a smaller wedding, 50 people or less, a large venue is going to make that feel even smaller. You're going to have a lot of extra space. Not to mention you're going to be paying a lot more money for something that you don't necessarily need. So if you're in love with a venue, you love the location and the setting and all of that, do whatever you want. However, keep in mind that you don't necessarily need to go with a traditional wedding venue if you are having a smaller guest count. That being said, if you are planning a wedding somewhere non-traditional like a backyard, private property, or an Airbnb, there's a lot of details that go into that. So I do have a couple videos for those as well. Definitely check those out, as there's a lot more involvement in planning a wedding that isn't at a standard wedding venue. Number 3, don't feel like or assume you can just plan a wedding on a shorter timeline or wait longer to make decisions because you're just having a small wedding. Vendors are still going to book up the same amount of time as they are for whether you're having a large wedding or a small wedding. And so even if you are planning a small gathering, even 30 people or so, don't wait till the last minute to book your vendors, because they will book up. This doesn't change based on the amount of people you're going to have at your wedding. Number 4, don't be afraid to still hire a day of coordinator. Maybe you're thinking about having a day of coordinator because you don't want to, on the day of, be managing guests or vendors or anything like that, but you feel like maybe it's not necessary because you only have so few people there. I will say, regardless of the amount of people that you have on your wedding day, you should be able to just simply enjoy and be in the moment and not have to worry about when vendors are setting up or if your guests are enjoying themselves or when things are happening. And this can go whether you're having 150 people at your wedding or 10 people at your wedding. There's still things to manage throughout the wedding day. There's still things to set up. There's still vendors to communicate with, and there's still a lot of behind the scenes things that happen even if you're having a small wedding. So if you're thinking about having a day of coordinator, don't let the fact that you're just having a smaller wedding stop you. I think that it is extremely helpful. You don't need a full wedding planner if you don't want to, but just hiring a day of coordinator regardless of the size of your wedding. And number 5, be aware of vendor minimums. So what this means is a lot of vendors will have a minimum order that you have to reach in order to book their services. So typically these are vendors like your catering, whether that's food or alcohol, bakeries, I've seen this done for desserts, and also florists. So if you are, when you're researching your vendors, pay attention to whether they have a minimum requirement or not, and you're likely going to want to choose a vendor that does not have that minimum, because it's going to be a lot more difficult to reach, say, a $3,000 minimum for flowers if you don't have 15 tables that you're decorating. So keep that in mind when you're searching for your vendors, and opt for ones that do not have a minimum requirement for your wedding. So there are my 5 tips if you are planning a micro wedding. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe to get weekly videos on wedding planning tips and advice, and we'll see you next week.